Those grandparents are like my parents. They handed down a legacy of disaffection, a rudderless, almost pious attitude about them and us. But in England, it was allowed to become a creed among the working class. Richard Hoggett, in The Uses of Literacy, was able to tell us that the English working class, what they were like in the mid-1950s, they had 10 features which are worth naming. 1, they lived in districts such as Hunslet in Leeds or Brightside in Sheffield. 2, they lived in back-to-back houses or in the new estates. 3, they earned a wage, not a salary, of about £9 a week. 4, they were educated at a secondary modern. 5, they speak with an accent. 6, quote, there is the cracked but warm-hearted voice, slightly spitting through all too regular false teeth of some women in their 40s, unquote. 7, they have their heart in the right place. 8, you can tell them by their clothes. 9, they like to pay out money in small monthly instalments. 10, they go on the panel at the local GPs, i.e., they take sick leave. I once tried the line, they go on the panel, out on a bunch of sixth formers, and they had absolutely no idea what that would be. Hoggart's book is fascinating reading today, in the age of Sky Plus and Nokia for kids. And you get a whole lot just by reading the chapter headings. There's no place like home, the neighbourhood, self-respect, putting up with things, the immediate, the present, the cheerful, and my personal favourite, indifferentism. The latter is the political point so far as I'm concerned. The English working class are far ahead of every other European lower class in the sheer energy of their indifference. If it were an Olympic sport, we would leave Poland gasping at the gable end. Most working class people are not climbing, writes Hoggart. They do not quarrel with their general level. The strong sense of the group among working class people can express itself as a demand for conformity. My connection is that most people in England are subjected to a sustained and ever-increasing bombardment of invitations to assume that whatever is right, so long as it is widely accepted and can be classed as entertaining. End of quote. And so, the working class of England today has no vision of society beyond the acquisitive, no version of themselves or their habits as being anything other than transitional, each on his way up or on their way out. The working class at its best in England is a waiting room for people who aim to become middle class, if possible. As a class, in and of itself, it appears to be dead. The aims of society, as Henry James once called them, are not part of the ethos of that class anymore, as knackered as the working men's institutes. If a foreigner asked, what is the moral universe of the English today, where would you point? The Daily Mail? Jeremy Clarkson? Simon Cowell and the instigators of the nation's favourite TV gladiatorial combat on a Saturday night? Where more young people, incidentally, more people under the age of 25, that is, vote than ever do in a general election. Is this the New England? On Radio 4 this morning, the likeable former tabloid editor Piers Morgan was talking about the glories of the TV show he works on called Britain's Got Talent. He started by saying how he deplored the idea that millions of schoolchildren want to be famous for no reason. It's a pretty vacuous pursuit, he said, before going on to say that his show, on which he judges brigades of dancing pigs with David Hasselhoff, is, quote, a very valuable public service. The hunger for distraction among the English working class is nothing new. But what is quite new is the need to find a sense of national belonging in that distraction. English national football is famous less for its achievements now than for its culture of hatred, that's to say abroad. The abstraction sits very easily in the English working class mind. Admiring the native skill of English players and their team spirit, so-called, has long since become some kind of synecdoche for the meaning of patriotic allegiance. Fans are moved to paint their faces red and white, not on election day, not even on Armistice Day, But on holiday in Mallorca or at international fixtures where 22 men will struggle to score goals, the figures recognise that English fans abroad will turn to violence in this situation faster and more regularly than any football fans in the world. According to one researcher, I'm quoting again, hooliganism for England abroad was in part about defensive patriotism in the face of wider national decline. That's what we know. During the conflict in the Falkland Islands in 1982, English football fans in Spain for the football's World Cup finals and for some less lethal fighting carried banners proclaiming themselves to be soccer's task force. Scottish fans, I should tell you, at the same finals seemed to have a different struggle in mind. Their most famous banner, seen before the clash with Russia, read, "Alcoholism versus communism." If the English, those words, the English, describes a collective, then our task here is to ask what binds it together. What occasions in public life offer the right opportunity for the joining and raising of English voices? Aren't football and club culture simply a way of doing it that appeals instantly to the leisure-minded rather than the labour-minded? People who can't or won't change their circumstances may be moved to celebrate them. We've always known that. In any event, the notion of a labour movement already feels like a throwback to the world of the Fabians. For the purposes of this lecture, I'm confining myself, of course, mainly to the English working class. Different lectures could look at the upper class and certainly at the middle class, the most often discussed nowadays. But the same fear of upset, fear of grief, fear of change, the same fetishization of continuity is very often to be found among the intellectual classes of England too. Noel Annan once wrote of, quote, "a paradox which has puzzled European and American observers of English life, the paradox of an intelligentsia which appears to conform rather than rebel against the rest of society." The sight of so many British historians turning up to have dinner at number 10 with George W. Bush the other month put this thought back in my head. Did none of them feel un-English enough to stand back from such a feast? Talented tellers of the national story to a man and a woman, but without any active critical recognition of the uses that story has been put to in defying progress. Once more, we saw inertia parade as passive acceptance. The English see themselves as being subject to the motions of institutions, but not really party to their evolution. If you really examine the public, if you actually talk to them over long periods, you begin to understand that as a generality, and one must stress that there will always be exceptions, whole swathes of exceptions, but as a generality, the English live in a miasma of what Isaiah Berlin called negative freedom. Their collective aim is to be free of interference, not to define the future. Berlin thought people were probably happier and more humane that way, which seems possible, but it does make you glad that the great philosopher was never in a position to harvest hope, never the person running Barack Obama's recent presidential campaign, for instance. But negative freedom is the currency of the English dispossessed. Whatever, say the English today when they're told something they don't like, and whatever is exactly what they get and what they're ready to accept, so as long as everyday life lies undisturbed.